Welcome to the Association for Popular Music Education's Debates in Popular Music Education. I'm Steve, and I'm a performer and educator with over 25 years of experience in popular music education, and I'm also the Vice President of the Association for Popular Music Education.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a musicologist at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom, and I have research publications and an ever-growing interest in authentic music theory.
So in this series, we'll serve as your hosts and your guides through some of the hot, some of the controversial, and often the thorny issues around popular music education.
And in each episode, we'll have guests who are experts in the field under discussion. We'll discuss, we'll critique, we'll pose questions to each other to kind of get to the nub of our understandings on that subject.
And at the close of each of these sessions, we're going to pose a provocation.
That's right, a critical or contentious viewpoint from the discussion, which we would like you as vested listeners to give your response. Now, Steve, how are they going to do this?
So we're going to encourage you all to respond to this provocation by posting to your social media of choice using the hashtag APME Talkback. Then, a couple of weeks later, Paul and I will seek to address and respond to your posts in a follow-up vlog. We really want this resource to be interactive as we collectively dig into your questions about and around popular music education.
So, without further ado, let's begin with this session's hot topic.
So today's hot topic will be, what does the performing musician need from a popular music education? So one thing to think about as we're going into this is, what is even a popular music education? What is even popular music? Well, Carlos Rodriguez suggests that popular music isn't an it, but a them. He says it's a vast, multifarious, and fluid range of musical practices with remarkably different and divergent intentions, values, potentials, and affordances. And if we kind of extend that idea, that definition of popular music over to popular music education, well, again, how can we offer more of these vast, multifarious, fluid range of musical practices to our students? How can we offer that to them in our coursework?
I agree with that completely, because we have the same problem with the idea of music education itself. If we're talking about popular music, this is a recent field if we're looking back into the teaching of music history. But the actual education, the idea of music education, how far do we stray into actual education studies and the actual demonstration of the skills and the theory of the skills and the composition and the analysis and how they all work together? For me, it's understanding is a critical journey, taking an enrichment process, building upon the skills and the interests and the passions that the students have. Mm-hmm. And, no discussion on this would be complete without talking about Bloom's taxonomy and going through all the way from those early stages of just remembering and reinforcing, going up to analyzing, to getting to creating. And that to me is a real value in music education, understanding that point of creation.
Absolutely. So now that we have some of the definitions, some of our ideas, or how our ideas have been formed around this, we're going to introduce our two guests today. Our first guest is Dr. Kat Reinhardt. Kat, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kat Reinhardt. I am the immediate past president of the Association for Popular Music Education, and I'm a professor at 3 different universities where I teach songwriting, pop theory, and voice, depending on which one I'm at. I am also a active performing musician and songwriter, professional songwriter in that world as well. And I have numerous albums and singles out in the world, and I regularly perform as a musician in addition to my teaching. And I also am an author of several journal articles and a book with Steve Hawley and many other crazy things that I do. And the co-founder of Songwriting for Music Educators, which is an online course for music educators to learn how to write songs. So, yeah.
Okay, and Corbin, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, yeah. My name is Corbin Jones. I'm a sideman based in Los Angeles. I play primarily upright bass and electric bass, but I also gig a lot on sousaphone and baritone saxophone, and I a range varying from like middle school bands to I have arranged with Lizzo and Beyonce and Jay-Z. So the full gambit of things you want to do and things you might not want to do. I'm your local friendly neighborhood bass player.
So here's a question for you all, and maybe we'll start with Corbin, but a question for both of you. So what did you all learn on the gig? And maybe in contrast to what you learned in the classroom, did they speak to each other, or were they two separate worlds with little or very little overlap?
Sure, I'll go first. Yeah, some things that I noted that I have learned that happened outside of the classroom that I did not learn in the classroom were some things as small as when you play music. In the real world, not everyone will tell you that you sounded good, or maybe if you sounded bad, people won't tell you that either. Sometimes they won't say anything, and you could have had a really great night. And there was like an internal meter that I needed to make sure I was developing and taking care of, because otherwise, there's a big roller coaster. And in school, I mean that we're there to learn, we're there to be critiqued, we're there to like get recognition when we're doing the thing that we're supposed to do. I'm not sure when we get recognition, but I think that's probably inherent to school. And I just like had a cold, hard, realization in the real world. It's like that doesn't really exist. Yeah, there's lots of things that I wrote down that we learn in the real world, but that one really stood out to me. Other things like show up early for call time, or know the other instruments' parts. That's also been influential for me. But sometimes some of that stuff gets covered in school.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's kind of like, I think people refer to it as like hidden curriculum. It's stuff that like it's not in something that's in a class. It's like the way you know how to walk in the room, and you know where to sit in your seats, and you know like how to kind of engage in that space, and you kind of know what to wear. I think that's really different when you get out in the real world. They're just different. They're not like completely different, but there are different kinds of elements that they're not really like, they're not written down. They're things like, make sure you arrive early. I mean, like in New York, it's like early is on time is late, and late is fired. Like I would say that to my students actually all the time, because like that's the way it was in New York. But when I was in Miami, sometimes people wouldn't even show up until like half an hour after the show was supposed to start, like to do the gig. And so that's a different way of like understanding how the system that you're in operates, and like what the expectancies are, and if you move from a place like Miami where that is the norm to a place like New York, you're going to get fired because you're late. But for you, that was like a normal thing that you were used to. So I think it's these little things. And I mean, as a woman, being in the music industry too, like there are things that they don't tell you that you're going to have to experience and deal with. But you're going to have to deal with drunk people at bars, and you're going to have to deal with, weird gigs, or, band interplay, and trying to figure out how to book a tour. And like, I mean, there's all the ins and outs. And I mean, I'm a band leader too. So it's just like, it's all that kind of stuff. Like, how do you schedule 5 really busy people, like, and how do you make it fun? And do you pay them? Do you not pay them? What's the etiquette? How much do you pay them? I mean, there's all that kind of, it's all the little stuff that like Corbin's talking about that there's an ecosystem in school that you understand how to operate in. And then there's an ecosystem outside of school where you have to learn. Some of it translates, but some of it is new, and you can't learn it in school because the ecosystem is different. It's not a failing of school. It's just, you can't do it there because it's just different.
Yeah, I often think about one of the things that I've often said, because I guess this was my experience, is that schools of music teach us how to get the gig through learning tunes, through chops, through technique, through all these intra-musical things, but everything else, doing taxes, what to wear, playing nice in the sandbox, being nice in the bandstand, all the other things, it's just, oh, well, you all will learn that in time. And the first time you sign a contract or do your taxes wrong, then that has implications on being able to do the other thing and how to actually keep the gig as well, certainly.
I'm intrigued as well by the thought, and Corbin, I want to go back to your earlier point about the idea of reflection, because you were suggesting there that in the school system, you expect the critique. You get that to grow, and yet you're quite right. As a professional musician, you've got sometimes no idea how it went, apart from just turning around to yourself, saying, "Hey, great gig, yes," and you're remembering all the mistakes. So, how can you teach reflection? Should that be part of that? How do you learn to think, okay, I think I did all right, but how do I know that? Is that something that should be within music education?
Wow. Um, I guess I would say yes, coming from like that not being part of the curriculum. I'm sure that other people would benefit from what I did get, which was not part of the curriculum. But I like just in mentorship, there would be moments where, you tell your teacher, like, I had a gig last night, and they say, how did it go? And you say, I thought it was terrible. And they say, what happened? And then, you're getting to say it out loud, and maybe eventually you're practicing doing that in your head, where you're like, oh yeah, like nothing bad actually happened. Or I'm sure something you guys have all experienced is you do a recording session, you're like, oh, that was terrible. You hear it a year later and you're like, oh wow, I don't know why, but that wasn't as terrible as I thought it was on that day. Like those kinds of experiences, I think talking through it with mentors was helpful for me. And if I benefited from it, I'm sure someone else that could be part of a curriculum. Someone else benefits from that.
What's your take on that, Kat?
Yeah, I think so too. And I don't know if you can teach the same things, but you can teach the active reflectiveness, right? So reflective journaling, I know, has been really beneficial for like myself, as just like writing down like what's going on in my head, kind of in the morning or at night or whenever it is, and just kind of monitoring that and making sure it doesn't like take a spiral. I think encouraging, good mental health and like that, those kinds of practices, because being a musician it's not easy. It's like you're constantly on the shoulda, woulda, coulda train. You're constantly in the comparison zone, especially with social media. It's super easy to go down there and get dark. And I'll get dark and I'll say to my husband, like, hey, because he's a professional musician too. And he's like, yeah, but other people are looking at you in the same way that you're looking at them. And I'm like, oh, right. Like I forget, I think, and it's so easy to go so fast. And when you're young, you don't have experience. Like, I mean, when I was young, social media didn't exist. So I got to have some space to kind of develop some of that, kind of like what you're talking about, Corbin, when you go home and you think about it, but it's not like immediately on someone's view or something like that, or you immediately go home and you see somebody else who did what you think is a better job. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that could be taught and talked about, and having people like come in and talk about what it's like, and because I think that can also be like, oh, I'm not alone. I thought only the young people felt this, and you find out like really experienced people have performance coaches, and they have therapists that they talk to, and they have like people that actually help them through these things, because they're such high pressure situations that they're in.
I think we're going to touch upon this a little while later as well, but there's a sort of sense here of a curriculum and a meta curriculum in what we're talking about. There's the sense that you need the jobs, you need the skills, you need the theory. And then there's those extra elements, and there's the contextual elements that you talked about, Kat, about knowing what it's like in particular areas or particular parts of this. So this kind of leads me on to my second question, which is, should we have a sense of consistency in a popular music education? Or is that variation implicit to the type of institution? And by the type of institution, I also mean its place.
I think there is danger, actually, like in commodifying popular music. I think that becomes really dangerous really fast to, and I don't mean like it's going to hurt anybody, but to the art form itself, because then it just becomes another hallowed ground in a thing that's like not pushing boundaries, not asking the students to like write things. I think there's a place for learning about the history and the cultural significance of popular music that came before. But if I'm in Atlanta, for example, like what's the music scene in Atlanta? It's a lot of hip hop, rap, R&B, there's country. Like if I'm at a school in Atlanta, I would want that program to kind of mirror what's going on around there, because then those people are going to get out into the field and probably stay in Atlanta because that's where they've made their connections. That's where like a lot of, and I think you can create these ecosystems in a way that really can elevate the schools. And so if you're a student looking to go into something like that, then that's where you want to go to school. If you want to do EDM, you should go to Miami because that's where like the huge EDM scene is, and like and like that's that, and Latin pop music, you know, like we want that at the schools. And if you're in Nashville, it's kind of everything, but like what are the kind of big, I think there's ways to kind of really use the place where the school is at to support the system of the school and to make it an individualized experience, because it's kind of like jazz has gone to the side of like, you know, no matter where you go, I mean, you're going to study with different teachers, but you're basically going to learn the same thing. Like you could spend 2 years at one school and immediately transfer and everything's going to just work because it's cookie cutter. It's like boom, 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 boom. And I think I fear that for popular music education because I don't know, it's such an alive thing. It's growing and changing and we don't ever want to lose that, but we also don't want to like, you know, if I had to go to new school, I want it to be like different, you know, and like throw me for a loop and make me learn something new. But just like if I move to Denver, that's going to be a really different scene. Like when I moved to Miami, very different scene, figuring that out. I mean, I think there's a little bit of danger in commodifying the system too much. I mean, there are always going to be similarities, but I think within those, what are you doing to really engage the community in which you're in? Because that's what popular music is about.
Corbin, you're nodding through that.
Yeah, it's funny because I loved it. I feel differently, but I actually really loved everything that you were sharing because I think I am coming from like classical music education, jazz music education, and like everything you said when I was in university, it was like this was the exact same thing that my friends in every other university jazz program were learning, right? And the thing that I love about that from a practical level is when I do a jazz gig in any city, it's not going to take 6 hours to do the rehearsal like it will if I do another type of rehearsal. So for me, from a practical level, what I find is friends who maybe even didn't have the opportunity actually to study in a university level like music education program is just the lack of communication. That's really the toughest hurdle that I've found. I do love the idea though of preserving the culture. So Compromise Jones says there's got to be a way to do both, right? Where we there's like a baseline level which includes like you need to learn how to read music if you're going to come through this program, and you have to learn how to hear a song twice and play it back, and you have to learn Nashville numbers, right? Like here's a baseline that we're all going to learn so that we can communicate. If you're going to spend all this money and go through all this training, like hopefully you are able to communicate with other musicians when you get out. But then also, right, like especially I'm in Los Angeles, so that's another bias that I have, but like when you get out into a scene, it has to be different. Their lyrics are going to be different. Every single person's background in that room is going to be different. So yeah, how do we preserve that? It should be reflected differently, but also just like if I'm preparing people to do this work and they can't communicate with each other, it's a little bit like, what are we learning?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that piece of it is super important that all of the schools would have, and they're not necessarily to teach them all the same, but I think like, but I'm more talking about like the repertoire part where people are
Sure.
only learning certain songs. They're not actually learning how to create. They're not like, and you get like this commodified, in stone repertoire that isn't just the history of something. It's like, well, if you learn this, you're going to go out, and they get out on a gig and yeah, they can communicate, but they've never actually been in the space where they have to make something up because everything they played is just something that somebody else did. It's more about like, I agree with you. I think the building
Yeah.
blocks are super important because we do need to be able to communicate it. It makes it, I'm jazz too, so, because that's what there was.
That's what they're.
But there weren't programs like this. I would have
Yeah.
gone, but I valued those skills. Like I can bring in charts to my band and like we can up a song and like 2 times through and it's like great. I'm not talking Greek. It's like right there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Me too. Same. Yeah, I feel it.
Yeah, it's interesting if we think about canonizing music education and what's the what's that baseline, that foundation of the foundational knowledge that we all need to know to be able to communicate, and then from there, based on place, if we're in New Orleans versus LA versus Austin versus Chicago, how is that going to look different? How is that going to feel different? But then also thinking back to the past, and I think Kat, you mentioned this, was how much of its soul did jazz education, did jazz give up for, to be accepted into the academy? And just Corbin, just like you said, anywhere you go, any music school in the country, hey, here are your 50 standards you have to learn. Here are the solos you're going to transcribe in this order. Here's what the improvisation class is going to be. Oh, you're transferring? It'll be fine because you just stay on that same arc at whatever other school you go to. So how do you find that both and?
If I add on to that just a little bit, I think one of my qualms and one of the most beautiful parts of the school that I went to is that they taught a lot about artistry. So I will say there's some people I graduated with who probably couldn't do sideman gigs that I do, which is okay. They don't have to, you don't have to do sideman gigs, but it was all about like, how do you create something new? And I had a teacher who was like, you sound like a play along. Like, what are you doing? Like, create something. And so specifically at my school, I know that was harsh, but it was okay. I also needed it. And it comes back into my mind if I'm phoning it in. I think I found it's specifically in the like 4 years that I was at that school, a pretty nice balance between like everybody knows Miles is solo on So What, and also like everyone is going to play it differently for some reason. In my class, at least, it was like we weren't listening to the same things. We weren't like all really playing together, especially once we got outside of school. Like everyone had their own voice because there was a big push on like, you're an artist as a jazz musician. And this is specific to jazz. I think popular music education does a way better job of that than like historically jazz school has done. But that is like a really, right? Like if we don't have it can't just be like what we're saying, the skills. It's got to be something else too.
Yeah, and that kind of wraps us into our third question is we've all talked about what we've learned on the gig, what we've learned in the school, and those transferable or maybe not so transferable skills back and forth. So do you need to be an active performer to teach popular music? And I guess the secondary question, or you can answer one or the other, how do those experiences as a musician in whatever arenas, whatever areas, whatever genres, how does that affect, how does that impact, how does that influence how you go about teaching in those areas?
I mean, I think it's complicated. I think if you're working with pre-professional students, there has to be some like high level of understanding and being in the music business of like, whether it's, decades of gigs or, or currently doing gigs, maybe you're 65, 70, and you're like, I really don't want to be doing gigs anymore, but I did all these gigs and I want to share what I learned with my students. So that doesn't mean active, but definitely have had that experience. And I don't mean like famous. I don't think that in fact, some of those people wouldn't make very good teachers because they're focused on that. Some of them do, but I think, does that person really want to share what they've learned or what they're still currently learning with, and can they be engaged with the student and not tell stories about so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? Because again, like what Corbin said, like people are paying a lot of money to go to these schools. Like that's not what they want to hear. That might be a little snippet of a conversation, but I don't want to hear, my teacher wax poetic about all the bands they were in for an hour and a half twice a week when I'm there to understand how to improvise and I don't get it. Like that's not helpful. So I think it's good if the person is really invested in the education of the students that they're working with, and really wants to help them succeed, or, it could be someone who, they played wedding gigs and, club dates their whole life. They've got a ton of experience. That's like ridiculous amounts of understanding, like, of how to do that kind of thing. So that's the class they teach, it's like, that's amazing, and to have that person be able to tell you, like, hey, you need to actually move when you're like standing as a backup singer, or, just like little things that, you're not necessarily going to get if you haven't had that actual like on board experience. And then going to like music education, like pre-service people, I think there needs to be an element of experience making popular music in order to teach it. I don't think you need to be a professional musician, but just like, I would never be able to conduct a choir if I'd never been in a choir. And I think there's an idea that like you can just learn how to teach this music because it's easy, and that it really like it's complicated on so many levels, and like that there needs to be like some kind of experience from the music educator who's going to be teaching it at any level, like K through 12 or above, like to have played with a rock band, even if it's in school, meets once a week for a year, and they like figure out, because you're going to learn so much about like how to help your students kind of navigate, how do you plug in, what is an XLR cable versus a 1/4 inch, like what does an amp do, what are IEMs, like how do you mix basic sound on a board, what does it look like, how do you rehearse something, how do you learn something by ear, how do you learn something off of just a chart, like all those little pieces that I think sometimes we take for granted. I think in the music education things of like, oh, we'll teach you how to teach it and not teach you how to actually engage with the music. And I think that's something that I'm so happy to be seeing so many music educators like doing, is like actively participating in making music and trying this stuff on and being like, oh, wow, that's actually like playing guitar by myself is totally different than playing guitar with a band, so I think there's room for all of it. I don't think you have to be like phenomenal. You definitely don't have to be world famous to teach people how to do this, but you have to have some experience doing it.
That's awesome. I wrote down like notes like so similar to that, where like you don't have to be active, right? But I wanted to add, I think it would be helpful if some people, or I think Kat said this too, like if there was someone who's doing wedding gigs or whatever, like real skills, like someone on staff should be active. I don't think that everyone has to be, but it will get to a point where it's like, okay, I know how to two-step, I know how to sing and play, but like I don't know what this new like amp module, like amp simulator guitar pedal does. You know what I mean? Like it will be helpful if someone who is actively working in the scene is also on staff. And I had a good mix of that, and I had famous people. And I just wanted to add, yeah, sometimes they were there and sometimes they were just physically not present, or sometimes they were present but not present otherwise. But yeah, so yeah, it doesn't have to be anything, but it is helpful, right, if people have experience in the thing that we're supposed to be learning from them.
Yeah, and I think that's what I mean by like engaged. Like if a student says like, hey, I want to work with this new thing, and like the teacher's like, you know what, I haven't heard of that one, but give me a week and I'll go do some research, and you have enough experience in that world to bring that to your research on whatever that pedal is, so that you can then come back to the student and say like, hey, like I did some research, here are 3 options that you might want to consider if you're looking into this kind of pedal, and here's why. But that comes from the knowledge that you're bringing to the table infused with the student's question. I don't think that teachers need to know everything. Like I don't know everything. I'm always learning. And like, I took logic lessons for the last 2 years just because like all my songwriting like students are like asking me all these questions, and I'm like, I need to be able to like actually help them in this stuff. And I can't be good at all 3 of them, but I can be, decent at like one, so that like, okay, I can show you how to work EQ. I can show you how to do these kinds of things. And it doesn't matter what program you're using. That stuff is you're gonna have to find where it is. But the way it works, is gonna be the same. And I think that's something for teachers to consider, is just like keep learning, and not getting stuck, I think.
So I'm going to jump in with that thought of the staff, the faculty, the collective, that you need that sort of experience within it. And I think a very interesting point there is about, you don't need the superstar name to be actually an active performer to have the value. I think it's kind of helpful when we first get the students, because they go, oh, you've worked with, and they see that as a form of authenticity. And yet, as they go through, they realize that the true authenticity is the fact that you're just actually doing it and getting paid for it, and they're actually being rehired to do it. And I think there's the word that I've just thrown in again, which is something I'm very passionate about, which is the authentic education element of this. You're not just learning this theoretically, you know why you're doing it. And it's you're setting tasks and skills to the students that is incredibly transparent about how it's used. And I can tell you how it's used because I did it last week. So that unbelievably segues us into question 4, which is a sort of cheeky question in a way. It says, does a popular music education adequately prepare the student or student musician, for a role in the commercial music industry? Now, we talked about this at the beginning. You taught how to get the gig, but not necessarily how to keep the gig. You've talked there about those meta-curricular ideas of tax or turning up on time and things like that. So do we actually think that, in general, the popular music education curriculum does enough to prepare the students?
Yes and no. As I read this question, like my hippie brain is like, well, what is successfully? Like I'm dissecting too much, but it is kind of like, it worked for me. It didn't work for my friend. How many students are supposed to make it? I've got a great friend who's still an incredible bass player, but he's got a great acting career now too. Were they successful? Like, I don't know, maybe he learned what he didn't like to do. I see where a lot of my friends learned skills, really specific skills, and are using them on gigs. And I see how, for a lot of them, it works out, and it's hard to tell. I have a hunch, like, what did they have to learn outside of school to stay on the gig, versus maybe what did school teach them? And I guess if I dissect that a little bit more, like, I have friends who play with lots of types of artists, and I think that they learned the skills to keep those gigs outside of school. I have friends who play with like a type of artist, or maybe even they're like friends with the artist or something like that, and they're still on that gig. Probably they didn't have to develop too many other skills outside of class.
I mean, I think it's impossible for a program to prepare all the students in that program for whatever they're going to do, because they're young. They don't always know what they want to do. They think they want to do something. I mean, I had people that I went to school with in undergrad that became doctors or lawyers after music school because that's what they decided to go do, and I see that in students that I've worked with as well, where like they go through this really intensive music program and they decide, what, that's not what I want to do. I actually want to go do this, or even halfway through they switch. So I think, no program can prepare you for everything, because that's just impossible. I think you can give basic building blocks and tools and resources and mental strength to an understanding of I think you can give all the pieces, but how that person is going to use those pieces is really up to them, and if they're really organized, they might go that direction. If they're not, they might go a different direction, and the school isn't necessarily going to be able to, it's just like the nature of school. Like, it's hard to, you're working with so many, as an educator too. I mean, I'm working with so many different elements in a classroom, like I've taught theory classes where I have people who came in and they don't know what a treble clef is, alongside people who've studied, jazz theory for 4 years and can play over giant steps, and they're all in the same theory class. How do you teach that? And it's beautiful, but it's also tricky, and I think you can't provide everybody the same thing. And I think it's kind of like, don't try. And don't shoot down the middle, try to do as much as you can. Like in that class, we split them, and like we had kind of half that were kind of like beginners and half that were more experienced. But even in those, like you're giving kind of slightly different assignments, or you give a test or something that has like, hey, or, if you know this and you'd like to challenge yourself, try these things and you can get some extra credit. It's like offering ways for them to be challenged in different spaces. And I think that it's hard to give everybody everything they need. It's not possible.
I agree. And it's the idea of the adaptive curriculum that you just talked about there.
Yeah.
You fully understand that the divergence that you've got in the room is huge.
And it's great that it's huge. It's amazing.
Oh, absolutely. But it's also, can be incredibly frustrating. I teach a theory class that deals with sort of 17th century harmonies. And you've got them who've learned such perfect, Royal School of Music version of this. And you've got those that have never come across it before. And I find them on a level playing field, because some of them have done, say, for example, a bar chorale, but never even thought about where's the lyrics. They've just actually done 4-voice harmony, and it does that too. But this idea of the adaptive curriculum and leaving enough space into it to be able to move through with the students, I think is a value that you're coming across with there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, going back to, I think what Kat and Corbin said is, how do you, if you have artists, folks who is like, I'm going to be an artist, I'm going to be a side man, I'm going to be a recording a session musician. How do you differentiate whatever the curriculum is to reach all those different folks, to give them the tools that they need? And I think a lot of the time, what I try and do is not necessarily help folks learn how to get that gig, that particular gig, but how do you get a gig, and helping students understand what's the framework for figuring that out. So then it's not necessarily going back to the idea of, giving them the fish as opposed to teaching them how to fish. The idea is helping them understand that framework, so they can then use that framework to get that gig and this other gig, even though they may be, one may be a side gig, one may be a recording session, one may be a tour. They're completely divergent, but you're figuring out some of the overlap between those varying skills that you learned on the gig in the classroom, that will then help you to better understand how to get and then keep each of those gigs as well.
So I think at this point, we're going to do this in every vlog. We're asking our guests, and then we'll go as well, to give us one text. And by text, I mean that in the most broadest of sense. What is it that you're going to share with the listeners? Corbin, do you want to go first? Do you want to tell us what you're going to share with us?
Sure, yeah. The resource that came to mind was actually a video that Steve shared with me, an Adam Neely YouTube video, it's like music theory and white supremacy. It's like triggering. And there's a lot of like really useful information in there. There's a lot of like opinions in there, but something that it did for me was got me chewing on the thought of like, how do I perhaps include the basic fundamental things that are like included in music all across the globe, and use examples from different parts of the globe. Like, sorry, music teachers who are already trying to fit, this much information in this much time, but it is, I've just found that there were so many similarities, and then perhaps so little effort to make it like see the similarities. So anyways, in that video, somewhere in the middle towards the end, but the whole thing is cool. I thought that was a cool resource for getting some wheels turning.
I love that video. And it's mind-blowing, triggering, like so many amazing things about it. That's a great resource. Mine probably I've been doing a lot of like songwriting stuff. So it's a book by Mike Errico called Music, Lyrics, and Life. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book that talks about like the interplay between music, lyrics, and life, and like how songwriting. I mean, it's a book about songwriting, but it's also just a book about like how to navigate a life well lived, and to kind of see everything around you, and to really appreciate the things that you have, and kind of take time to spend on those kinds of things that you have. And I mean, it's through the lens of songwriting again, but yeah, it's a great book. And yeah, that would be one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. Steve, what's yours?
So mine it's an article I read a couple of years ago by Adam Patrick Bell. Adam is a musician, producer, scholar, all-around great guy, teaches up at University of Calgary, and he wrote this article talking about don't take the production out of music education, kind of using that as a framework, as an idea to better understand music education. But the big thing I got from it was that he talks about, and we've talked a lot about, what should a music education, a popular music education look like? Should it be strict and canonized, and here's what it looks like everywhere? But he really talks about how popular musicians, that we're this huge mosaic of colors, and he actually uses the Jackson Pollock painting Convergence, which if you ever seen Jackson Pollock, it's kind of just everything everywhere. But he talks about, Adam says, a more accurate model to depict the myriad ways musical cultures and their associated learning approaches intersect and integrate would be this Jackson Pollock. So popular musicians and the way we learn, we're a colorful collective colliding from all these different directions. So that's why I definitely don't think it's like, here's how here's what a popular music major and education, a course or a curriculum looks like, and here's what it should look like and feel like and sound like everywhere, no matter where you are.
So mine to share is kind of the obvious one that we were all waiting for, but it's the Routledge Companion to Popular Music Education, oddly enough, and I've gone for the chapter right at the end, the Dylan Smith, which is the epistemological and sociological issues in popular music education. And you know what I really like about this is really early on, page 451, the newness of the field. It's still finding its feet. It's still defining its parameters. We mentioned this at the beginning. I really don't want popular music education to lose that sense of its newness, or to find out what its parameters and go, that's it, we're set, we're good. And I think in this conversation, we've moved towards a position where that fluidity is perhaps some of its strength.
Certainly. And one thing I'll mention for all these resources, if you look in the description to this video, we'll have links down there where you can go and you can find all these various resources.
So we've got two final things to do, and then the first is to thank Corbin and Kat for some fantastic information, and thank you for sharing that with us. We really appreciate it. Super thought-provoking. And should we do the provocation, Steve?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, here we go. This is deliberately provocative because it is a provocation. And so what we'd like you to think about, listeners, what would like you to sort of bounce on that social media link back to us, and we'll consider and we'll give our thoughts on is, what intended learning outcome or skill can be removed from popular music education?
We'd love to hear your responses to the provocation. We encourage you to join the conversation on your social media of choice using the hashtag APME Talkback. We'll use your responses as the foundation for our continuing conversation in part 2 of this blog. Have a topic you'd like us to consider, a question you'd be keen on us digging into, or perhaps a provocation of your own? Reach out to us using the hashtag APME Talkback. We look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.